So I just woke up and I can think of nothing better to do but talk about 6v6, so that's what I'm gonna do in my pajamas. The 66 test kind of concluded for Overwatch. They're still running a min 1 max 3, I believe, at the time of this recording. But for the most part, the real meat of the 66 test kind of concluded. And there's a lot of things to discuss here. We could talk about why it succeeded and we could talk about why it failed. And we're going to go into the deeper criticisms in just a moment because that's the type of video that I'm doing. And I want to clarify, though, that the reason that we're going to be doing so many of these criticisms is not just to crap on Overwatch. I think it was fine. It was a successful test. A lot of people had fun. I had fun. Nothing really to say about that. I do want to criticize some of these things, though, because I think some of these things apply to 66 or 5v5 regardless. And also, if we do a 66 test again, or we want to implement some form of 66 moving forward, I think there's a lessons that we've learned, and I want to make sure that this feedback is out there for when the game actually goes live or when we do these things again. Now, that being said, before we get into the critical aspects, there's a lot of positive things for me. I think that from my 66 tests in the workshop code, I think sustain wasn't necessarily a problem, like some sustain watch just clump up with shields. Back in Overwatch 1, we've had metas like that. That was clearly not the case with the workshop testing that I did, and with the testing of the actual 66 test, it was also not a problem. Sustain was not really much of a problem at all, at least in comparison to what we have with 5v5 already. Not a problem. Nice job. Good to hear. Great to hear. Double shield, not really a problem. A lot of the really frustrating, nasty tanks to play into were not dominant. Again, I kind of knew this going into with all my workshop code testing, but it was good to see that it indeed wasn't a problem. A lot of tank synergies were really good. The map design of Overwatch 2 has improved significantly, and while there's still some choke difficulties, it was so much better than Overwatch 1 consistently across the board. So great job to the map design team. That's really encouraging for 66 moving forward. Tank synergies were fun, as I said, but the other thing too as well is like just playing off tank was so much fun. Playing tanks that enable your tank like D.Va and Zarya, or even tanks like old Roadhog and Sigma, who aren't necessarily an off tank that supports their tank, but a tank that can't consistently take space on main like so many other tanks can, or from an angle. And so just the ability to kind of like let somebody else take the heat and you can kind of control the side lane space, kind of like a DPS with some sort of mitigation. It felt really good. It felt like the identity of those characters was really restored, as opposed to some of the difficulties they've had in Overwatch 2 with 5v5. And I think no matter how you think the test was implemented or any of the criticisms that we're going to have of the test, those things were just done really, really well. And it felt so good to have those things again. And I'm going to have my notes pulled up here. And we're going to talk a little bit more about those things. I guess the last thing to point out as well is that I was definitely very afraid that support would feel terrible because you'd be spending a lot more time heal botting. I do think that objectively was the case. You definitely had to heal bot more, but I think support still was fun. So if you are a support player really concerned about 66, I like the proactivity of 5v5. I don't think that's gone. I do think that is diminished, but I still think that you'll enjoy the game in 66 if we do end up going that direction. So if you didn't get a chance to play it, I highly recommend that you seek out the workshop code. I'll try to remember to link that in the comments. Maybe even give the min 1 max 3 a try. A lot of people are crapping on min 1 max 3 right now, and I don't think it's a serious game mode, to be perfectly honest with you. I think they're experimenting more with how flexible they can be with things, but I think triple tank is just so strong. But honestly, like, it was still fun. Like, even playing DPS in that mode was still fun. So okay, so we're gonna get to criticisms here, and there's a lot of them. Some of them you can probably guess, some of them you may not guess, some of them I think are little details, some of them I think are big things that need to be addressed, and some of them just have to do with the game as a whole. Number one, the timing with Rivals was unfortunate. I mean, everyone knew this was coming. They knew the risk. I believe I heard that Rivals released was a little bit early. You obviously have subsequent Hazard release, you have the new season, it's the holidays. Personally, for me, I was not able to play the 66 test until basically Christmas was over, until it was already in the arcade category, because I just didn't have the time. I had to grind Hazard to coach the character. I had to put out Rivals content that I had planned, you know, not because I felt like I had to, because I wanted to. Like, Rivals was really an interesting problem for me, and I think it was for a lot of other people too. Like, for me personally, I still enjoy Overwatch a lot more. Certainly, I enjoy many of the characters in the game design a lot more, but that's just me. And I think a lot of other people, especially people that were very vocally unhappy with the 5v5 and current state of Overwatch, those are also the type of people that were probably more likely to try the 66 test unless Marvel Rivals was released. So you have this conflict of interest where the type of people that were very vocally in support of 66 were also the more likely to be the people that were going to play Marvel Rivals, which is just really unfortunate timing. I think, obviously, maybe they didn't know exactly the release time of Marvel Rivals. I'm honestly not sure, but they definitely knew the general ballpark. And so there's this conflicting interest of, like, we need to get this out as quickly as we possibly can, but we also don't want to compete with Marvel Rivals. But the fact of the matter is, if they hadn't released it then, when would they? Because even now, Rivals has definitely diminished a great deal from player base and Twitch viewership, but it's still a huge game, and it probably will be a huge game for quite some time. It's exciting, it's new, it's flashy, it's a lot of fun. So it's gonna stick around for some time. So if not then, when? So There's not really a good answer then. I think the obvious one is, well, they should have done this sooner. Yeah, it's a fair point. Moving on to the next point. Season 9. Let's talk about this. So I actually had Gavin Wenner, who's the systems designer for Overwatch 2. And at the end of my stream here, he says the Season 9 changes to implement would have taken forever. Basically, to implement them took forever to implement. Now, to get rid of them would have also taken a long time for the test. And I know a lot of people were very vocal about my not using Season 9, pre-Season 9 health pools for my tests in the workshop code. And now to you guys, I say respectfully, frick you, because I told you that they would not be able to implement it or revert it. Now, this isn't in some insider training that I have. It was just a prediction that to do something that big, not just with the health pools, but more importantly, with all the projectile size hitboxes, would be incredibly difficult. And playing the workshop code, I felt that with the smaller health pools and the easier and bigger projectile hitboxes, it didn't feel like an honest test, and it wasn't likely to replicate exactly what they were, the Overwatch was going to be able to implement anyway. And it turns out that's exactly what happened. So the problem with this, though, is that ultimately, I think my stance on Season 9 has definitely been a negative one. And I'm going to have a video, if it's not out now, it will be out sooner, about a full review of Season 9 1 year in retrospect. And it's overall been a negative thing. There's been some good aspects, there's been some bad aspects. We're not going to go into those today. But the important thing is that there is a lack of lethality loop with some tanks with the amount of risk that you're taking. Because essentially, you have a combo of like a Winston bubble jumping onto a backline or a ball slam and so on, right? And what Season 9 did is it reduced the spike of lethality for those combos, right? That burst damage. But it didn't necessarily reduce the spike of lethality for tanks. In other words, you go for a tank cycle, a bubble Winston or a bubble Ryan or Matrix this, or you go for a Sigma combo, or you go for a ball slam, whatever. A lot of the risk that you take is you get blown up really fast. You don't really benefit from those larger health pools as much as a tank, I felt. And so when you go for these risky combos, you would like to be like, okay, if I'm going to get blown up as a tank because of my smaller health pool, I like the ability to do that to you. And I felt like these squishier characters benefited a little bit more from those health pools. Now, that was just my impression, but it did definitely cause some issues with the spike of lethality for tanks, is basically what I'm saying. Essentially, where that could be a good thing if you like playing support and DPS and you don't like getting one shot by the perfect tank synergy combo. But I think that's exactly what people that wanted to play 66 wanted. They wanted that reward for that synergy, for that timing, for that team play, right? And that obviously comes with a lot of baggage, but if that's the type of gameplay that you want, then that's more likely to come with 66 within the inherent synergy, the tank synergy that you're kind of going in there. Tempo, essentially the timing, the synchronization, rewards and kills, and it doesn't feel like that's as much the case in Season 9. Now, that's just a very short list of some of my issues with Season 9. We're not going to go into the other ones, that's for the other video, but that's one I found more unique to 66, and I don't think Season 9 changes necessarily ruined the test by any means. I don't even think it was necessarily the most important thing that they missed, but it is something that I think that's worth pointing out. Moving on from there, in general, I think bad maps, bad heroes for the maps had more potential for disaster than 5v5. So I think if you have a lot of the map design has improved, as I said. I think some of the hero design has also improved in some aspects. There's more flexibility. There's less caricatures, basically, that can only do one thing. But there's also like a lot more potential for screwing that up. The best example that I can give you is Ryan Zarya on Watchpoint Gibraltar on, like, let's say attack, right? That sounds like a combo that works, but it doesn't work on Gibraltar because both of those things are really bad on Gibraltar up until third point. So you essentially have in 5v5, you might have a solo tank that's like not great on that map, but at least it's just the one guy. And if anybody thinks that you're completely reliant on your tank to take space in Overwatch, I'm sorry, you're just a moron. This is objectively wrong, and it's been the case for a long time. But in 66, you now have two people that don't fit the map. And so now your chances of being incapable or having difficulty taking space are increased. So basically the worst case scenario for the map, depending on the hero, depending on the map, is higher in 66. Now, that being said, it's also lower, because what if you had a Reinhardt, oh no, but you had a Diva on Watchpoint Gibraltar? So basically, this isn't so much as a criticism as it is just something that you have to make your own mind up. Do you like the higher risk, higher reward of we could either have a really bad tank combo, we can have a really good tank combo, or we can have a bad tank, but then the other person picks around that tank, around the map, not just around the tank, and gives me a hero that I need? Like, okay, we have, I don't know, Winston on Circuit Royale. Not a great map for the guy, but my second tank picks Zarya or picks Sigma. A map composition, maybe Sigma doesn't exactly synergize with Winston, but he certainly synergizes with the map a lot better. So that's going to make you feel a lot better as a backline. So it gives a lot more responsibility on the player to make the right choices. The problem is that some heroes heroes in some maps are still difficult. Maps like Circuit Royale are still difficult. And obviously heroes like Malga and so on, they're still problematic. They're still pretty much one tricks in what they can do. So there's a lot more potential for problems. There's a lot more potential for solutions. If you like that high risk, high reward, you're going to like this. But it is high risk, high reward. You're putting a lot of faith in your tank line if you aren't one of the tanks to make the right choice for the maps. And my problem is I don't trust the community understanding right now to understand the importance of the map. A lot of old school mindset still infiltrates a lot of our understanding about, synergy, and Ryan Zarya is great, and you pick around this, or but I even saw people trying to play Orisa Sigma, even though Orisa is not even close to the same character. Like, she's literally a different character than she was, just because those characters have worked before historically, and they have completely different goals now. They don't synergize with each other really at all. And I think that's kind of my concern here, is like you would have these big spikes in really, really, really bad games. In the current implementation of things. So, if you want, I talked about this with Overwatch Classic as well. Like, if that's the type of Overwatch that you like, then I don't think that I can say that you're objectively wrong. And if that's the type of Overwatch that you don't like, then I don't think you could say you're objectively wrong either. I just think it's a really choice. That being said, I still want to say that, like, we shouldn't have characters like Orisa and Malga. We do, and that's just kind of how it is. And at least they're not strong. More on that later, but it is what it is. Okay, there are more, in theory, consistent outputs. Less stomps equals more players. We don't really know this for sure. I had asked the Overwatch team to take a look on the 66 test to see if there were fewer one-sided matches. It's kind of difficult to do with quick play rules, which kind of sucks. Also, they should have had ranked. Okay, can I just take, they should have done ranked. I know it's hard to implement, but they should have at least had ranked rule sets, because having the quick play format just doesn't work. It's too short. They've had done that before early in Overwatch 2. I think it was like the beta, but yeah. I've completely forgot that, but that really needed to be implemented. That's okay. Moving on. In theory, having more players leads to more consistent outputs because variance doesn't have as much impact. In other words, think about it. Like, if you roll 6 dice, you're more likely to have a more consistent output of number than 5 dice, because the more dice that you roll, the probability kind of evens out. And so in theory, that should mean fewer one-sided matches than 5v5. I don't necessarily have the numbers on that, but that makes sense to me. Maybe that can conflict with having a worse tank do on a worse map, but as I said, I don't think that's as often a problem. Like Ryan Zarya and Watchpoint Gibraltar, there aren't too many maps that demand the right tank combo or the right tanks to function. And so I would be curious to see what the results of that test, if they were able to run it, would look like. This is a big one, and I don't see enough people talking about this one. The current implementation of armor is essentially they reduce small instances of damages, but big doses of damage don't really reduce incoming damage at all. In other words, it's like -5 off of a Pharah or a Junkrat shot. And that's kind of how it was implemented in Overwatch 1. And Overwatch 2, they changed it to a flat percentage. But the problem was that made tank busters like Reaper and Bastion, even like a Tracer shooting on an angle or a Diva shooting on an angle, way too strong versus armor. So they reverted it. And I've done a big video on this. Maybe my editor can link that one, where I talked about it with chat. We kind of solve what they need to do, which is essentially a minimum threshold for damage and a maximum threshold of damage, right? So that there's at least 15-20% reduction on big explosive sources of damage, because the current implementation of armor with the reduction of the health pools to 66, it really showcased how bad cheese characters are playing versus tanks, like as in how good they are versus tanks. Like playing into Junkrat, Pharah, Hanzo, Mei, Torbjorn, any of these characters, not just because there were more chokes to spam in because there was an extra tank. That is true. That definitely didn't help. But a lower health pool and armor that just doesn't matter at all versus these characters. It felt really bad. Most of my negative experiences playing tank in 66 was not necessarily because my tank dude didn't pick the right character, besides Orisa. It was because I'm playing into a choke with double projectile. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm getting 2 CP flashbacks, and how incredibly brain dead those projectile characters. Now, I remember there was a lot of whining about projectile characters and their strength. I don't remember exactly when it was, maybe like 2020, 2021. Especially moving towards Overwatch 2, where a lot of projectile characters felt targeted with a lot of nerfs, and hit scan was permanently meta, tracers and so on. And this kind of excludes Genji from that. That's another story. But I remember having this discussion where I was like, well, it's kind of a complicated topic because projectile characters have been cheese characters for years, right? They have been the choke spammer characters. Not that they don't have good skill ceilings, but the value floor of what you can do is just kind of existing, and shooting at tank is really good and has always been good. The more bodies there are and the lower those health pools thresholds are. And I found that I was reminded of that again. And I don't think necessarily that this means we need to nerf projectile characters if we go 66 necessarily. There are some aspects that maybe, like you'd have to look at Maywall and so on. But I think the big thing is that like armor can't function as it currently does at 66. I mean, it barely functions well in 5v5. I think they should change this in 5v5 as well, to be honest with you. I think it's unquestionably the case. In fact, I think it's why Junkrat has been strong for quite some time recently. But it's just absurd to me that we don't have a minimum and a maximum threshold already with armor. I've been told by all my backseat programmers that it's actually not that hard to implement. It doesn't lead to really wildly inconsistent damage outputs at all either. Certainly not more so than current implementation of armor. And it just leads to this really inconsistent value of armor, which is really hard to balance around. I just think that this is unquestionably needs to be the case. And it's not just obviously about projectiles either. It's like any big a Widow headshot, right? Basically does full damage versus an armor tank. And I think that just leads to a balancing nightmare for when you want armor to function with things and when you don't. It's just super inconsistency of output. And this just needs to be changed. This just needs to be changed, 66 or 5v5. Moving on from that, we'll talk about tempo here. So I kind of briefly touched on it earlier. Tempo is essentially the timing of your engages. We talked about it earlier, like your Ryan gets bubbled, he needs to swing. Your Hog is taking space in a flank, you need to push on main. It doesn't necessarily mean the timing of your cooldowns in terms of having the synergy, but just two tanks applying pressure at the same time from wherever they're at. It's very important that you hit that timing, because if you don't, you're going to miss your window of pressure. It really depends on your preference, right? A lot of Marvel Rivals, the irony here is that like a lot of Marvel people went into Marvel Rivals kind of wanting that 66 Overwatch experience, and it's really completely different than old school 66 Overwatch, where the tempo and the timing is crucial, and if you miss that timing, you just kind of die, but then you can one-shot other people, like you can destroy other people. Where Marvel Rivals is a lot of existence and sustained pressure and sustain, and you may not die for your mistakes, but you're going to lose space or lose cooldowns. Getting that uptime cycle with Overwatch, however, is really difficult, and it's difficult to do consistently. It's very rewarding if you get it right, though. You know, you can be compensated with another warm body holding space for you, but honestly, that doesn't really happen. Basically, it becomes super important that you play to the timing of your resources. I can't tell you how many games that we lost playing a supported DPS because my Ryan would get bubbled and hold shield for a second, and they go, oh no, I gotta swing, and the window's gone, right? Hog takes an angle for a hook, he misses the hook, or Sigma's not pushing up with the Hog at the same time or on the angle, split from the Hog, so the Hog goes for the hook, immediately gets shot out like really quickly, right? And then the Sigma applies. It's basically like a seesaw, and that just doesn't work very well in Overwatch 2. And I know a lot of people have discussed like, oh, the seesawing of tank cycling of tank pressure, like the Zarya bubbles the Winston, and the Zarya takes the space after the Winston. And there's like little aspects of that, but the big thing is that you need to get the bubble with Winston and then apply pressure at the same time. And this is not just the tank's responsibility. This is the DPS and support. It's like you have to play at the timing of your tank, because your tank can't just exist for long periods of time anymore. If you hit that timing, great. If you don't, you don't. This is, again, not a criticism. Maybe I should have phrased this differently. This is just something that you have to be aware of when you play, and this is a slight shift from what we're at with 5v5. Good thing, healers did not necessarily have to heal, not to an excessive amount. Still far more interesting than Marvel Rivals, with all due respect. But you do definitely have to heal more than you do on 5v5 right now. General understanding that we have learned from 5v5 about space control, timing, damage, and so on definitely has helped break some of the habits. I think the general understanding of the support community is a lot better than it was. Not a major downside overall. I think it was fine. I will say this. We're going to get to the balance stuff in a second. There's a couple more things that I want to talk about really quickly here. Potentially, they might have gone a little bit too hard with the passives nerf overall for tanks. Maybe a minor version of the boop negation would have been nice, because seeing a huge hulking 7,000-pound armored hero that isn't Reinhardt go flying from a Lucio boot felt a little bit harsh. I'm glad that they removed the headshot reduction. That was just silly. I've always hated that passive, but maybe they could have gone a little bit more close, a little bit more friendly with the boop one, maybe a weaker version overall. I think chokes can still be tough. We talked about that one earlier. Tanks can still contest DPS up close. In other words, a Sigma on a close angle. If he's able to hold that close angle, then you're not really going to be able to push him out with really any DPS or most DPS. Long angles as well. So basically, tanks can still contest DPS in proximity on angles. So if you're trying to take an angle and run into a tank, unless you can poke out that tank from a distance with most characters, you're not really going to be able to remove that tank most of the time. That's just kind of the nature of 66, take it or as you will. Last thing here, and this one is a good thing we talked about earlier, but off tank / non-engaged tank, Roadhog, Sigmas. I mean, Roadhog got reverted, so that's nice. Roadhog, Sigma, Zarya, D.Va, enabling tank. It just felt great. It felt so good. The most fun that I had playing in 66 was playing Zarya, playing D.Va, playing Roadhog, playing Sigma, and just the nature of like I can control an angle and not be the center of everybody's attention all times. I can enable my tank. There's that sense of team play and camaraderie, which felt really good. I remember I played Reinhardt Diva on King's Row, and we were holding this first or second point choke, that really nasty choke, and I just controlled that high ground and that flank for like 6 years, and it was just every single thing that got thrown at my Rein, apart from directly at him, I shut it down every single time. And I'm not even a phenomenal Diva player. I do understand how the character functions, obviously, but my mechanics aren't great, but it just felt so good, like I'm helping, I'm contributing, I'm doing my job. The bubble timing, or like, oh, I'm bubbled as Rein to get going, it felt really, really, really nice. Overall, just felt really, really good. And that's kind of like, we'll stop with that there, and we're gonna get more into the balance side of things. Actually, there's one more thing I'm gonna talk about here. I'm gonna say one more thing, and I do think that this is important. Part of it was the armor, part of it was tank and tank synergy, part of it was just a lot of other like tiny little factors. But I will say that I don't think 66 engage main tank, Winston, Rein, so on, felt 10 times better. I went in expecting things to be a little bit more, and it still felt very feast or famine. I felt, especially when playing versus projectile DPS, especially when playing with a tank that didn't support me or help me, there was a lot of downtime. Reinhardt, you're not swinging, you're not the main character. You will get a swing or a pin, maybe occasionally, certain situations, and then there's a lot of downtime. You're going to be spending a lot of time shield botting with Reinhardt in 66, even with the right tank synergy. The only time you don't is if you're just basically demolishing the enemy team. And I felt similarly with Winston, where you cannot peak at all without losing your entire health pool. Your bubble breaks basically instantly, almost instantly, and then you're kind of played in a situation where you have to give the enemy team a lot of respect. I didn't find that main tank was not fun at all. It was still fun. It's just, it isn't like this magic pill that makes tanking all of a sudden really great. And I think this is something that we've already known, but I think it deserves repeating, that main tank, and besides off tank, who just gets all the glory without any of the responsibility, it will always be a somewhat thankless and very inconsistent fun role. The nature of taking space, taking initiative, taking attention can be very unforgiving. And now you've done that, and now you've just reduced your health by a significant amount. And yes, you can theoretically often benefit from that other tank, but you're also getting pressured by the enemy tank too. And so, I think that I question some of the balance choices they did with some of the main tanks. Maybe we'll get into that in a second. But overall, if you are a main tank player, I encourage you to really think, and if this does come back, or play with a mindset of like, does this feel differently than if I were playing this exact same character in 5v5? And to be honest with you, I think 66 felt much better for the off-tank position because it gave me a sense of identity. But as a main tank, I still felt like a punching bag. I felt like a punching bag in some situations, felt like I even had less agency. I had some really ugly Reinhardt games where there was just not a lot I could do besides shield. Pin, hold shield, and just hold shield, and hold shield, and hold shield, and hold shield. And that's something that I think we're going to have to kind of come to terms with, is like, whether 66 or 5v5, the main tank, the engaged tank, will always have the impetus, will always have the responsibility, and it will always feel difficult and tricky at times. So all that being said, let's talk a little bit about some balance stuff, which I think was also pretty bad. I think the general theme here is that it seemed to be a really general concern that tanks were going to be too OP, which again, this is why I did the workshop test. I would have appreciated if I know I'm just a content creator, but this is why I did the test, is so that going into the test, maybe I could give some feedback to the developers about some things that they can keep in mind. And I think that there were some things that they could have learned from my workshop test. Things like tanks were not that OP. With nerfed health pools, that's pretty much all they needed. Even though there was 2 of them, we didn't have double shield compositions that worked. We didn't have sustain metas that worked. It was just generally heal body and sustain and shields. There was a lot of concern about that, and I think a lot of it was unfounded. I don't think that those things are that good, even when you add another tank. And I think that's a little bit frustrating for me, but also, again, a compliment to the development team since then, and the map design team since then, where we don't have old Orisas anymore. We don't have release Brigittas or release Baptistes or release Moiras anymore. Sustain is still good in its own right, but it's beatable, and dive often felt like the more mobile compositions have felt the more consistent compositions overall. And so I think that fear led to some balance decisions, which I don't really agree with, and we'll get to those in a second. I think ultimates took way too long to build. Again, that felt like more of a sustained tank brawly focused change. I think it took way too long to build ultimates. I believe it was off of ult charge from tanks was harsh further. I don't remember, but I actively felt like my ultimates built slower in 66 than they did in 5v5. I think the heal passive, so the nerfed the out of combat heal passive, I think from 5 seconds to 7 seconds, somewhere around that ballpark. I have to get the hard numbers. That felt terrible. I don't understand why that was done. It's not a sustain thing. It just felt terrible. Felt like a lot of over concern again about sustain and all the wrong rays, and it just was a horrible quality of life change that actively harmed my enjoyment of the test. I think that if we talk a little bit more about their general balance philosophy with tanks, there was a definite shift towards longer cooldown cycles. And I think Alec Dawson spoke about this a little bit, where it was the question of we want to make sure that there's downtime between tank cooldowns. And I understand that, but I think my point has always been that we don't like having long cooldowns. We like having less potent cooldowns that are more frequently available. Just makes a lot more sense. Like they even reverted Ana, for example, to a lower cooldown on Nade and Sleep Dart, which was interesting. But I've said this about Ana and really a lot of other heroes as a whole. It's like, just make the cooldown less strong. Don't make the cooldown do everything on a 17-second cooldown, right? Playing, for example, Ramattra felt really bad at times because they increased the shield cooldown to like 17 seconds. Like, that's insane, right? Cardiac with Malga, probably a cooldown that's we need to be careful to look at in 66. But again, what is it, 17 or 18 seconds? Like that's just insane downtime. And like that to me is just not a gameplay loop that is very healthy when it comes to playing tanks. Nerf the HP on Ramattra shield if you're worried about double shield. Nerf the passive heal sustain or the AoE damage reduction from Cardiac Overdrive with Malga if you're really concerned about that. I think there was a lot of increase the cooldown changes with tank overall, which I think were really ill-advised given the feel and enjoyment of playing the characters. It's not necessarily a huge balancing problem necessarily. It just wasn't fun to play. It wasn't as fun to play, and it wasn't related to 6v6. That's the thing, is this wasn't needed for 6v6 to function, and I think that's the difficult thing for me. Quickly going down the tanks here, D.Va Zarya felt great with an engaged tank. Roadhog Stingray had off-angle contesting identity strongly in place and felt like you had more uptime as a result of your main tank taking attention. We talked about engaged tanks being very feast or famine. Orisa was just terrible. I know that she's already terrible on live, like really, really bad. Maybe the worst tank that we've ever had in Overwatch 2. So I freaking hate this character. I hate this character. I don't even mind. It's the combination of 6v6 not feeling great for this character, but also it's all the things they've done, you know, like the headshot, and then she's slower with Fortify, and then they went a step further and they made her able to headshot her during Fortify, right? Which is something we've been asking for a while, but when she could actually move with Fortify and when she actually had gun cooldown, well, now she's just headshot during Fortify. And then she has fall off on her weapon. Like, the character functions like a poke character, which she doesn't in 5v5, even though she technically has long range damage. Her massive hitbox and no long range damage mitigation while she's also shooting, unless she's fortifying, which is a huge commitment. Yeah, long story short, poke damage isn't really a big deal with Orisa. It's partly a big deal when you combo with your Javelin, but that's such a niche situation, which could be corrected by Javelin hitbox, but anyway. Long story short, Orisa was really bad in 66, like really, really bad, like live bad, but much worse. And it felt like these nerfs were done because, oh, Orisa is associated with 66 and she has poke, but that's not how she functions at all. And I think that, again, a lot of the nerfs with Orisa just didn't show where she was over nerfed, and some of the nerfs also, to me, weren't super well calculated in my opinion. Ramattra, I was not as much of a fan of in the workshop code, but I played him more in the actual 66 test, and he was surprisingly okay. And there's one thing that I didn't factor in when I initially gave my negative review of Ramattra during the workshop code, and it was the fact that there is another tank. If there is another tank that you can shoot with your Omnic form, with your staff, you feel like you have some decent impact, because that's the current problem with 5v5 Ramattra, is that basically you can really only shoot the enemy tank, and there's only one of them. His staff projectile speed is terrible, his spread is terrible, so even like pro players just don't really play the character for the Omnic form all that much. So having another tank to pressure and shoot, like, I was able to get decent value out of him, even in poke maps, just because there's another tank that I can put pressure on. So it was kind of interesting. Definitely map dependent, mostly because you need that other tank to shoot. Vortex on Choke was also decent. He felt okay. He's still Ramattra, he still has some problems, but he felt a little bit better. Ball felt pretty good if you're good at ball. AoE pressure felt really good. Mines felt really good. Slam felt good. Shields felt good. You definitely needed somebody to help you with your engages, and killing those isolated targets, as I talked about with the Season 9 change, definitely didn't feel good. You're not able to consistently combo those characters like you could back in the day. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, that's up to you, but that's good to know. Maybe, yeah, I think overall, like, balancing, it felt like they were a little bit too excited with buffing tank busting, but quality of life of like having Zenyatta reverted, Ana reverted, Hanzo induction, that felt pretty good in their own right. Generally, tank busting definitely was a bit easier, but not always easy. Forehead, because a lot of the original Overwatch 1 characters are not as good. You know, Mei doesn't have her freeze anymore. Bastion's not quite as strong as it used to be. Definitely some points where it felt a little bit strong. Pulse bomb from Tracer's huge. We talked about projectile characters already. I mean, freaking Echo lands stickies on a tank and you're basically already in beam threshold. So now Echo is back to her tank busting that she used to do in Overwatch 1. Widow is still really strong when you have space on defense. There's been, again, we've talked about this before in my previous videos where there's a lot of discussion about like Widow's not very good in 66 or you can choke out a Widow. It's really, really easy on defense to have your tanks mark the enemy tanks or flankers and just hold an angle on defense and you cannot touch Widowmaker. And I had a lot of games where you could go Somber, you could go Ball, and you, first off, you make a mistake, you die. And those angles are a lot more contested, but Widow is just still Widow. And again, this kind of brings to light the fact that it's not a format issue with a lot of these characters, it's just a character issue. And there's no way that you can sugarcoat it. It's just Widow will always be Widow. For moving on to support here, Lucio definitely felt like there was more opportunities for core impact without having to angle as much, which was neat. Kiriko felt pretty bad. She felt very congested, cramped, and more heal body. Fewer angles to take. Her matchup versus tanks isn't all that good, so she can't really poke them out like she can DPS and enemy support. So her identity kind of tanked, and again, take with that as you will. And I definitely think supportals as a whole, there was a definitely general uptick in value, which makes sense. I think tank ults as well, just because there's a lot more congestion with how the fights are happening. So all that being said, I think I had a lot of fun playing the test, a little bit before and a little bit after the holidays, and it mostly confirmed more of what I suspected from the workshop code, with some new insights as well. And I do hope that the developer is able to learn a little bit from this if we do move forward with these tests moving forward and make some adjustments on exactly what they need to do. The big ones, armor needs to be dealt with. We need to decide what we need to do with Season 9. And then really, I think the way that they're balancing around like the heal passive, the ultimates, and honestly, the cooldown cycles for tanks, I think was a little heavy-handed, and I hope they do a better job of that moving forward. Anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.